Episode 1 asked why self-awareness sucks. 18 episodes later, here's the answer. It was worth every single bit of it. And the other thing I noticed? I've had too many regrets in my life to stop here now. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, and welcome back to Self-Awareness Sucks. Before we get into it, I just want to say I'm not a psychologist, a therapist, or a medical professional, and I'm not claiming to be, and I'm not here to give advice or a diagnosis. Everything I share on this podcast is based on my own experiences, thoughts, and observations. So please take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and if you are struggling with anything I mention, please do reach out to a qualified professional or at least someone you trust. This is episode 18, the last one, and I want to start by going back to where we began. Episode 1 asked a question. Why does self-awareness suck? And the answer I gave then was this. Because once you start, you can't stop. Because the tool that's supposed to help you understand yourself can also be the thing that makes you unable to just exist in a moment without analysing it. Because knowing things doesn't automatically change things. And because the gap between the person you can see yourself becoming and the person you currently are is one of the most uncomfortable places to live. All of that is still true, and it was worth every single bit of it. So that's what this episode is. Not a list of lessons, not a summary, a story of what self-awareness actually does to a person over time. What it cost, what it gave, and why, if I had to go back to the beginning knowing everything I know now, I would do it again without hesitation. Before I go through the season, I want to say something about the emotional intensity of it. Because I think it needs saying, and I think it's one of the most compassionate things I can offer to anyone who's been listening. If you followed along this season and found yourself thinking at any point, that wasn't that deep, or why did that affect her so much? Or I've been through something similar and it didn't hit me that hard, I want to address that directly. The event is never the whole story. The interpretation is. The version of me who experienced being called fat and ugly at 7 years old had no counter evidence, no framework, no language, no wider world to compare that community against. No understanding of why those words were being used or what they said about the people using them rather than about me. What she had was the only context available to her. And in that context, those words were catastrophic. Not because she was fragile, because she was a child with enormous sensitivity and no tools yet to work with. And the same is true for every experience I've described this season. The boring comment, the dismissal of my music taste, the summer transformation that never came, the years of not feeling chosen. In the moment each of those happened, I was working with the data I had. Limited information, limited perspective, limited language, and a nervous system that was doing its best to make sense of things with what was available. Self-awareness didn't make those experiences bigger than they were. It made them comprehensible for the first time. And comprehensible is the beginning of free. So if you have been listening and finding yourself comparing your own experiences and wondering if you're entitled to feel as much as you do about them, please just stop. You are allowed to feel whatever you feel. The feeling was always logical, given the premise. And at the end of the day, an emotion is just a chemical reaction that happens in your brain that you can't stop. What changes with self-awareness isn't the legitimacy of the feeling, it's the premise. And that changes everything. Now let me take you back through the season. Not every episode in equal detail, but the threads that mattered the most. The ones that actually changed something. Episode 2 changed how I communicate. The white lies seem like a small thing when I look back at them now, but they weren't small. They were the operating system. They were how I moved through the world, constantly managing the narrative, adjusting the story, softening the edges of reality so that what I presented would land in a way I could predict and control. And the cost of that wasn't just the dishonesty, it was the exhaustion, the mental load of keeping the story straight, the low-level persistent unease of knowing somewhere that the version you were presenting wasn't quite true. And it also kept me inside a box, a particular performance of a particular person. And that performance made it easy for people to take me at face value in a way that wasn't entirely accurate. And it can tip very easily into people pleasing. Saying the easy, untrue thing instead of the hard true thing keeps you small. It keeps you within a set of parameters you've set for yourself based on what you think people can handle, rather than what's actually true. And it can make it very easy for people to take advantage of what they read as your good nature, because you've trained them to expect compliance rather than honesty. Stopping that was the first real act of self-determination in the whole season. Not dramatic, just a quiet internal promise to choose honesty even when honesty was harder. And what it gave me over time was stronger relationships and better communication and a much clearer understanding of my own emotions and other people's, because when you stop softening everything, you can finally see what's actually happening. And it gave me genuine confidence. Not the performed kind, the kind that comes from knowing that what you're saying is true. Episodes 3 and 7 changed my relationship with my own body and my own effort. No one is coming to do it for you. That sentence hit differently the more I sat with it. Not just about fitness or skin or the goals I kept setting and not reaching, about everything. About the experiences I was waiting for instead of facilitating. About the version of myself I was waiting to become instead of actively building. About the realization that I was a passive character in my own story, waiting for the plot to move when someone had to be the writer. And that someone was me. Episode 7 was where the physical version of this became real. The skin journey, learning to be present in my own body rather than at war with it. The dance workouts in my room alone, failing privately over and over until failing privately stopped feeling like failing at all. And the coaching program I mentioned in the last episode is the current version of the same commitment. The scaffolding being built with the goal of eventually not needing it. These episodes together changed the relationship between what I know and what I do. The knowing-doing gap doesn't close automatically, but it does close. Slowly, unglamorously, through repetition and showing up and choosing again when you failed to choose correctly. And I think that's enough. That's more than enough. Episodes 4 and 5 gave me permission. Free will is reason enough. That episode sounds simple, and yet it isn't. It's the dismantling of the idea that you need justification from outside yourself before you're allowed to want what you want. That you need to earn permission to pursue things. That the "who does she think she is" voice gets a vote. And to be cringe is to be free. That episode gave me back things I'd been keeping in a smaller space than they deserved. Like going to Disneyland Paris twice in 6 months because I wanted to, and that's reason enough. Singing every word of 5 Seconds of Summer concert and not apologising for knowing every single word. Buying childhood toys I never got to have. Going to Legoland and Chessington with my family because I never got to go as a kid. Posting about the things I love on Instagram without managing how that looks. And going back to all the things that made me loudly, specifically, unapologetically myself, without guilt, and instead with full pride. There's something that connects episodes 4 and 5 that I do want to point out explicitly. Both of them are essentially about the same thing underneath. Permission. Permission to want what you want. Permission to enjoy what you enjoy. Permission to be the version of yourself that likes what she likes and does what she does and doesn't require external validation before any of it counts as real. Those 2 episodes together cleared the ground for everything that came after them. And episode 6 changed how I understood my own story. The boring comment, the dot outside the circle, the confirmation bias loop that turned one person's casual cruelty into years of evidence. The summer transformations that never came. All of it. What episode 6 actually gave me was the framework to understand why certain things hit as hard as they did. The imaginary audience, the loop that turned every piece of evidence that confirmed the story into proof and discarded everything that contradicted it. And once I had the framework, I could start to question whether the verdict was ever accurate. And the answer was no, it never was. The boring comment wasn't a verdict. It was one moment, one context, one person who didn't have the full picture. The dot outside the circle was a context, not a permanent condition. And the confirmation bias loop, once named, could be interrupted. Not entirely erased, just interrupted, which turned out to be enough. And episode 8 gave me the shadow, the Wikipedia belief, the boring narrative, the self-imposed parameters, the realization that the things running quietly in the background, shaping my behaviour without my conscious awareness, weren't just habits. They were beliefs I'd never examined, and examination, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable, is the beginning of choice. The shadow doesn't disappear when you look at it, but it stops running the show automatically. And that's the most important thing I can say about shadow work. It's not about getting rid of the difficult parts of yourself. It's about bringing them into the light so that they can't operate undetected anymore. And episode 9 gave me language. Finding the words for things I'd been experiencing without being able to give them a name. Diaspora, double identity, affect labelling, connotation and denotation, paralinguistic features. The frameworks from my education finally being turned on myself rather than on texts and historical events. And the realization that language isn't just a tool for communication, it's a tool for understanding. Once you have the word, you have a handle on the thing. You can pick it up and look at it and put it down. But before the word, it's just fog. And fog is almost impossible to work with. But once it has a name, it becomes something you can actually engage with. The fog doesn't disappear, but it becomes workable. And workable is everything. Episodes 10 and 11 gave me the architecture. Self-censorship, fear, the panopticon, the 3 fear profiles, the faking fear theory, the internal fear index, and the paralysed analyzer. These episodes were the ones that named the mechanisms. Not just what I was doing, but why, and how the whole system was connected. The awareness that the imaginary audience I'd been performing for lived inside me, not outside me. That the guard and the prisoner were the same person, that the watching doesn't need to happen for the behaviour to change. The possibility of watching is enough. And the faking fear section of episode 11 is still one of the most honest things I've said. Sometimes we stay still not because we're genuinely terrified of where we want to go, but because we're terrified of the middle. The uncertain, unplanned stretch between who you are and who you want to be. And naming that, finally calling it what it is rather than letting it masquerade as legitimate caution, was one of the most freeing moments of the whole season. And episode 12 broke the loop. The confidence loop, the data problem, not having the data, the relationship giving me the first piece of evidence that I was someone who could be chosen. And the 3 versions of myself, the child before the bullying, the person in the middle, and this one, who is closer to the child than she's been in a very long time. Just a little bit wiser and less naive, and grateful for what the middle version taught her, even when it was painful at times. And I really do feel for the person I was in the middle. I really, really do. She kept going. She wrote a lot of really good poetry, but she got me here. And I will always carry a piece of her with me because, as I said before, you are the sum of all your parts, not just one version of yourself forever. Episode 13 was the one I was living in real time. The grip, the Goldilocks zone, the master's post-driving lesson moment, the NUS competition I won and forgot about, and the admission out loud that I want this podcast to do well, really well, that I want it to become the thing. And I said I'd report back, and I will, but first, let's get through the rest of the callbacks. And episodes 14, 15 and 16 zoomed out. The parasocial trap showed me what it means to be on both sides of a one-sided relationship, to have been shaped by people who don't know I exist, and to now be in the position of shaping people who I may never meet. And the responsibility of that, and the recognition that the voice I didn't have, that I wished had existed when I needed it, I could be that voice. That's why this podcast exists. Not despite the parasocial dynamic, but because of it. Context changes everything, reframed the bullying words. Fat, ugly, weird. They weren't the problem. the context was. And the context can change. The room can get bigger. The culture can shift. The thing that made you an outsider in one room can make you interesting in the next. That's not consolation. That's just how context works. And understanding it means the original wound stops being a verdict. It becomes a context. And contexts are changeable in a way that verdicts aren't. And letting yourself be misunderstood gave me back the music. The things I'd been keeping quieter than they deserved. And the watch me that arrived at the end of that episode. That's the answer to the who does she think she is shadow that has run underneath this entire season. Not defensiveness, not justification, not a case for why I'm allowed, just watch me. And look at episode 18. Watch me. And last episode 17, named The Paradoxes. Self-awareness is recursive. It folds back on itself. It creates problems it was supposed to solve. It demands courage it doesn't automatically supply. But the purpose of it isn't to spend the rest of your life watching yourself. It's to watch yourself long enough that the person you're trying to become eventually becomes the person you are. Self-awareness is the bridge, not the destination. Now, the self-imposed parameters. This is a thread I introduced in episode 8 and promised to come back to properly, so this is properly. I was living inside a costume I didn't make. Not a deliberate one, not anyone explicitly put on me and said, this is who you are now. It was a lot more subtle than that. It was the accumulated weight of years of feedback, explicit and implicit, from a very small and very insular community during the most formative years of my life. The quiet one, the nerdy one, the one who doesn't put herself on a stage or in the public eye, the one who doesn't have the audacity to do something like start a podcast and talk about her personal experiences as if they're worth listening to. And I'd absorbed it so completely that I'd stopped questioning whether it was true. I was just living inside it, measuring my real life against an imagined version that had been fed to me through TV shows and films and the unspoken social hierarchy of my particular corner of the world. Waiting for the makeover moment, waiting to become the version of myself that was allowed to do the things I actually wanted to do. As if there was a threshold of acceptability I needed to cross first. As if I needed to earn the right to want things. And interestingly, nobody ever said any of this out loud. And that's the thing that gets me when I look back at it. There was never an explicit statement, never a naming, never an acknowledgement that this hierarchy even existed. It was just a kind of agreement everyone had silently made, and I had silently accepted it. And then I'd carried it with me long past the environment that produced it, into contexts where it had no business being. Into university, into jobs, into relationships, into the question of whether to start a podcast. I was perpetually measuring my actual life against an imagined version of it. And the imagined version was based on TV shows and films and other people's lives, which meant it was never achievable and never real. It was a fiction I was trying to live inside, and I was always disappointed when reality didn't match. Not because my reality was inadequate, but because the standard I was holding it against was entirely invented And what's even stranger is that I was carrying a low-level sadness because of it. Not debilitating, just this constant low-level melancholy that I didn't even fully recognise until it lifted. As I said earlier, that middle part of myself wrote really good poetry, and it was because this low-level melancholy was useful for writing poetry. It gave a lot of my creative work a particular quality, a particular weight. And then I started breaking free of the parameters gradually over the last few years, and I've actually stopped being able to write poetry because I'm just not feeling that sadness, that melancholy anymore. And I want to say that clearly. I stopped being perpetually sad, not because my life became perfect, not because everything has worked out exactly how I wanted it to, but because I stopped measuring my actual life against an imagined version of it and started just living the actual one. And actually, my writing is the clearest mirror of this. I talked about this in a TikTok video actually on my account, but when I wrote the fan fiction I've talked about as a teenager, it was all fantasy. Adventure and magic and infinite possibility, because I was on the precipice of going out into the world and everything was still unknown. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's a psychological reflection, because I was writing the world as I needed it to be, full of potential and magic and the sense that anything could happen. Because for me, at that point, it still could. Everything was still a mystery. And throughout university, while I was studying identity theory and using psychoanalysis, I wrote a lot of psychological thrillers, because I was inside the process of understanding the self, making sense of how people work and examining the mind. And so naturally, my writing followed where my attention was. And what I'm interested in now, and the story I'm writing now, is based in real life, grounded in relationships and the everyday, with a bit more romance and a bit more of, I think, probably what I actually want. And I think it's the reflection of where I am now. I've lived the fantasy, I've done the analysis, and what I'm interested in now is the ordinary, extraordinary of real life. Connection, love, the thing I probably actually want and haven't fully let myself admit until probably right now. I think that what we create is what we're looking for without knowing it. An unconscious desire made visible through the work. And the fact that my writing has changed so completely is the clearest evidence I have that the person has changed. And truthfully, the fanfiction felt impossible to finish towards the end, because the prospect of that infinite possibility, that magical unknown future, felt hard to access once I'd actually lived it. The mystery had been partially lived, and it's as sad as it is honest to say that. But the sadness of it isn't a loss. It's a sign of how much has been gained. You can't grieve something you haven't had, to an extent. And this podcast is another version of the same thing. I couldn't have made this 5 years ago. Not because the thoughts weren't there, but because the person who could say them out loud wasn't there yet. She was still very much living inside the costume and still waiting for permission and still measuring herself against the imagined version of who she was supposed to be before she was allowed to do something like this. I felt restricted by something I didn't even create myself. And when I say it out loud, it sounds absolutely crazy. But at the same time, it also sounds completely, heartbreakingly understandable. Because that's what the formative years do. They install things, and sometimes what they install is a set of parameters that were never yours, that were never accurate, that were always just someone else's limitations placed onto a person who was still too young and too unformed to know she could reject them. So I reject them now. Not with anger or resentment, but just with the quiet, settled certainty of someone who finally knows the difference between a costume and a self. And I want to name what that costume actually was, using the language I shared in episode 10. Erving Goffman called it the front stage self, the version of you that exists for an audience, shaped by who's looking and what you think they expect. And for years, my front stage self was the costume. The quiet one, the careful one, the one who pre-edited everything before it left her mouth, who managed the narrative, who stayed within the parameters she'd been handed without questioning whether they were hers. The backstage self, the one who exists when no one's watching, was always different. She was the one singing in her room, the one who had all the opinions and all the words and all the confidence. In private, where it was safe. The performer, the alter ego I talked about in episode 10, the one who never got an audience because I decided she wasn't safe to bring on stage. What this season has been, in Goffman's terms, is the gradual closing of the gap between the front stage and the back. Not eliminating the front stage entirely, because everyone has a front stage. That's just how social life works. But making the two versions less different, less far apart, until the person you are in public and the person you are in private start to resemble each other closely enough that neither one feels like a lie. And that's what the costume coming off actually looks like. Not a really dramatic reveal or transformation, but just the front stage and the backstage slowly becoming more and more the same person. And this podcast has been one of the clearest examples of that process in action. Because this, right here, is as close to the backstage self as I've ever been in public. And the fact that I can say that in episode 18 is the whole point. Now, the report back. I told you in episode 13, and I mentioned it earlier, that I was gripping tightly to this podcast. That I wanted it to do well, that I wanted it to become the thing, the career, the path, and that holding it with an open hand while everything in me wanted to close my fist around it was harder than anything I'd tried to release before. Because this one I'm building in real time, every week, out loud. There is no filing it away in a journal and forgetting. It's just here. So here's the report. I still want it to do well. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And yes, there was a version of me that hoped it would take off overnight. Similarly to how my fan fiction did, where you somehow just get it just right and the numbers move and suddenly you're at 231,000 reads before you fully understand what happened. And I'm not ashamed to admit that. I think most people who put something out into the world secretly hope for that. The version where it just works. But this is long-form content about niche personal experiences and psychological theory. in a world that is increasingly short form, in a world where it's mainly podcasts about people laughing together or interviewing celebrities that get the numbers. And this is not that. This is me alone in a room talking about things that are uncomfortable and personal and sometimes quite heavy. And it may never explode overnight. And somewhere across these 18 episodes, I made my peace with that. Not through resignation, but just through an understanding. The fan fiction worked when I stopped watching it, and the Masters Prizes arrived when I'd forgotten I'd written them in a journal. The NUS competition came back when I'd stopped thinking about it entirely. The things that have come when I let go. And this one is no different, even though it feels that way. Even though I can't just file it away. What I can do, and what I have been doing, is just enjoying the process and actually truly enjoying it. Not performing enjoyment whilst gripping the outcome, but actually being inside of it and reveling in the satisfaction I get from creating these episodes every week. And something has genuinely shifted across these 18 episodes. I feel a lot more relaxed and I feel more natural and more like myself. And the irony of discovering that in the last episode of the season is not lost on me. But it's true. And I'm coming back for season 2 because I've only just found my feet. So the true why of this podcast, the one I could only find by making it, is this. I have felt for most of my life like someone going through very specific, niche, particular experiences, receiving them through a very particular lens and feeling alone in them. And I've spent years watching other people articulate the things I thought only I felt. A creator saying something in a video that described my exact experience so precisely it felt like being read. A comment on a post that made me think, oh, you too? And a podcast or a book or a conversation that gave language to something I'd been carrying without words. And then I started to think about what we're like as children. Kids across the world who have never met, who don't know each other, who have grown up in completely different countries and cultures and languages, all seem to do the same things. Checking when the fridge light goes off when the door closes. Watching raindrops and silently racing them as they drip down a window. Putting a finger in a tap to make the water spray out sideways. Conducting little experiments in curiosity, independently, simultaneously, without coordination. And literally only a couple of days ago, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. And it was a photograph of two toys side by side. On the left, an ancient pull-along animal on wheels from the Cucuteni Trypillian civilization. I have no idea if I've just pronounced that correctly. And that was created somewhere between 3950 and 3650 BC in a country that is now known as Ukraine. And on the right side, there was an image of a modern play school toy. Basically identical. 5,600 years apart, and some child somewhere in a completely different world was playing with the same thing. And it made me realise that people have literally just always been people. And it's become one of my favourite facts about the world because it just makes everything feel slightly less daunting. And in that same photograph, underneath it, there was a quote from Marcus Tullius Cicero from 106 BC. And it said, "Times are bad, children no longer obey their parents, and everyone is writing a book." That was said over 2,000 years ago, and it was the same complaint, the same anxiety about the younger generation, the same sense that things are worse than they used to be, which means they probably weren't, which means we've always been doing this, which means you are not as alone in your experience as you think you are. We are all doing the same things without knowing we're doing them. And I think there are experiences that feel uniquely isolating, privately ours, too specific to possibly be universal, that are actually just the human experience in a particular costume. And if this podcast has done anything, I hope it's been to take the costume off. To show you that the thing you thought was only yours is probably someone else's too, just in a different format, in a different life, in a different room, but the same feeling underneath. And that's what I want this to be. Not guidance, not prescription, just someone saying the things. And I could only discover that by making 18 episodes. And I would make them all again. And season 2 is coming. There's more to say. And this episode's Uncomfortably Honest is the one I've been sitting with since episode 11. It's a bit different this time around, but I said there's a specific flavour of fear that I hadn't talked about properly yet. The one where all the others collapse into one simultaneously. The performance anxiety, the anticipatory dread, the terror of conflict, all at once. That it had cost me in ways I was still counting, and that I'd come back to it when I was ready. So it only feels right that I'm ready now in this season finale. The bullying I experienced growing up was almost exclusively from boys. And the cognitive dissonance of that is the specific thing I want to point out, because I don't think I've said this directly before. The people who were most consistently unkind to me were also the people I was supposed to eventually want to be chosen by. And my brain had no framework for that. So it resolved the dissonance the only way it could. It decided I wasn't someone who could be chosen, or would be chosen. And it filed that as fact. And then I carried that fact forward into every subsequent interaction, projecting the assumed rejection onto people who didn't know me yet, before they'd even had a chance to form an opinion. Getting so nervous, my voice would shake and I would turn down dates, not because I didn't want to go, but because every part of my nervous system was saying no before I'd consciously processed the question. And if I did go on a date, I'd word vomit in conversations to fill the silence, because silence felt more threatening than anything I could say. The self-fulfilling prophecy of not feeling enough, of not being someone who gets chosen. And I didn't have my first proper date until I was 20. I didn't get into my first relationship until I was 23. And I don't say that with any shame, because there are no timestamps on when these things are supposed to happen. And I talked about that in episode 12, but I say it because the absence of those experiences for that length of time wasn't neutral. It was very loud. It was its own kind of confirmation bias, its own kind of data point that the loop kept filing as evidence. And it wasn't one moment that shifted it. It was accumulation. Working in a restaurant and finally having male colleagues and friends, going to Australia, doing my master's, and having the no one is coming to do it for you realisation, and that landing properly. All of it slowly building until something clicked. I stopped organising myself around the imagined reaction of a specific audience I'd internalised. I took the male presence off the pedestal I'd unknowingly put it on, and started just being myself. And then the relationship came, and then it ended, and the data persisted. And I now have male friends and colleagues I talk to easily, including people from school who I could barely look at when I was younger. And it just isn't daunting anymore. It cost me a lot. Years of turning down things I actually wanted. Years of being smaller in interactions that could have been bigger. Years of letting a story that was never accurate run the show. And I'm still counting some of those costs, but the counting is different now. It's not evidence of how broken I was. It's evidence of how much work I've done. And the fact that I can say this out loud in episode 18, when I couldn't even name it properly in episode 11, is itself the proof that something has changed. So I want to say something to the person who's been here the whole time. 17 episodes before this one. That's a lot of listening. That's a genuine commitment to something uncomfortable. And I know that some of what I've said has been very specific to me. Very particular. A very particular community, a very particular set of years, a very particular collection of experiences that are mine and not anyone else's in exactly this form. But I do hope, across all of that specificity, you found something that was also yours. Not the specific memory, not the specific person or the specific comment or the specific moment, but the feeling underneath it. The one that doesn't have a tidy name until it suddenly does. The one you thought was only yours until you heard someone else describe it. The one that made you feel, even for a moment, slightly less alone in something you'd been carrying in private. That's all I ever wanted this to be. Not a guide, not a prescription, not a set of instructions for how to do self-awareness correctly. Just someone saying the things, the uncomfortable things, the contradictory things, the things that don't resolve cleanly and probably never will. Just saying them. Because the saying is the beginning of the understanding, and the understanding is the beginning of the choice. I've had too many regrets in my life to stop here now, and that phrase has been sitting with me since episode 16, and what it means, finally named properly, is this. I spent too many years not doing the things I wanted to do, not saying the things I wanted to say, not being the version of myself I actually was, because I was too busy being the version other people had decided I should be. And I've accumulated enough regret from that pattern to last several lifetimes. And I'm not adding to it. Not anymore, not here, not with this. So watch me. As I said, that's the answer to the who does she think she is shadow that has run underneath this entire season. And it is not a defence, and it's not a justification, and it's not a case for why I'm allowed. Just watch me. And look at episode 18. Look at 18 episodes. Look at what happens when you stop asking for permission and start deciding the discomfort is worth it. So before we close out, I want to go back to something I said in episode 1, as it deserves to be answered properly now that we're here. I said that self-awareness becomes this constant, never-ending loop of noticing, questioning and deciding, and then starting all over again. I said there's this idea that growth is supposed to be glamorous, that once you've done the work, you arrive somewhere and everything becomes magically easier. Like there's a finished version of you waiting at the end of it. And I said that's not how it works. That there's no big moment where everything clicks and there's no overnight transformation. And all of that is still true. I haven't arrived. I'm not finished. I'm still very much in it, and I'm still crossing the bridge, as I said in episode 17. At present, the coaching program is still running, and the romantic fear thread is still something I'm navigating, and the podcast is still something I'm learning to hold with an open hand. The self-awareness is still generating new things to notice and new patterns to examine and new moments where I catch myself mid something and have to decide what to do with that information. There is no completing self-awareness. There's no certificate or finish line. There's no version of you that gets to put it down and say, right, done, I know myself now. The loop keeps going. The noticing keeps happening, and the deciding keeps being required. What changes isn't that the process ends. What changes is how you feel about being in it. At the start of the season, the loop felt like a burden. Something that had been switched on and couldn't be switched off. Now it feels more like a practice. Something I'm getting better at. Something that, on a good day, even feels like the point rather than the obstacle. That's the difference between self-conscious and self-aware. Not that one is done and the other isn't, but that one feels like a trap and the other feels like a tool. And I'm still learning to use the tool, but I know what it's for now, and that changes everything. Here's what I want to leave you with. The thing I described across this whole season, the self-consciousness, the dot outside the circle, the white lies, the confirmation bias, the imaginary audience, the performing a smaller version of yourself for a crowd that wasn't even watching, none of that was a flaw. It was a sensitivity. It was attunement. It was the same quality that made me good at reading people, good at language, good at noticing the thing underneath the thing. It was just pointed inward, and it was being used against me. Self-awareness didn't change the fundamental thing, it just redirected it. It's the same sensitivity, it's the same attunement, it's the same tendency to notice everything and feel everything and process everything at length. It's just pointed outward now and being used for something. For this. And I went from self-conscious to self-aware. Same trait, different direction. And the difference between those two things is the whole season. Self-awareness sucks. It's recursive and contradictory and exhausting, and it creates problems it was supposed to solve, and it demands courage it doesn't automatically supply. And courage isn't the absence of discomfort. It's deciding the discomfort is worth it. And it was worth it. It was always going to be worth it. I just had to get here to know that. So thank you for being here. For every episode, every thread, every uncomfortably honest moment. I'll see you in season 2. Bye!